Okay, folks, welcome to our next lecture for HI 237 Vikings. And this is Vikings Through Their Own Eyes. So, this is the second part, basically, of our introductory lecture. And we are going to try and look at the sources that we do have from the Scandinavian side of the equation. Now, we have talked about how the sources written by non-Scandinavians were very problematic on the subject of Viking activity. And again, this is justifiably so. I mean, if you're raid victims, you haven't had a good experience with these people. This doesn't mean that there aren't Scandinavian sources. They're just very difficult to work with. Now, I mentioned that they weren't conventionally literate. This doesn't mean they were illiterate. They did possess a script that we call runic script, and it was designed for engraving on wood, bone, metal, and stone. Now, very little has survived of our runic script from this period. Wood, of course, is highly perishable. Metal corrodes or is melted down and reused. Even stone can weather or wear away. From what we're able to tell, the runic alphabet is fairly limited. There are only a certain number of letters. Some sounds are not represented at all, and so spelling, therefore, does not closely reflect pronunciation. And things like punctuation and word separation was inconsistent. So if you were going to sit down and try and interpret a runic inscription, this needs a high degree of specialized skill on your part. It's very, very challenging. So, I mean, keep in mind, interpretation is not a simple thing. First of all, you have to transliterate the inscription. So you have to turn the runes into a form of Roman script, which is a lot easier said than done. Then you transcribe it, then you translate it. And none of these steps are simple. There's a lot of separation between a translation of an inscription and the original inscription because there are so many different layers of interpretation involved. Now, in terms of numbers of runestones, we have about 3,000 of them from Scandinavia. The majority of them are from the 10th and 11th centuries. We have a few from the 9th. Maybe a little more than a few, but it's a much smaller proportion. Now, there are earlier inscriptions as well from the Vendel period, so the previous pre-medieval period in Scandinavia, but there are many, many fewer of those, and they are much more difficult to interpret. The rune system back then seems to have been much more elaborate, whereas in the later period they simplified it. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that runestones were a custom that spread southward from the more northerly regions of Scandinavia, but it's hard to say that definitively. Now, in Denmark, and specifically in Jutland, runestones become a common practice among the upper classes. So because the elite embrace this practice, we sort of have a golden age of runestone erection, starting in about 950. And we see it not only in Scandinavia, but also in the British Isles. All of these, the runestones from this period, almost all of them, are very similar in their language. They will start with X, raise this stone in memory of Y, and then some filling in names, of course. And then sometimes they would go on to give additional information. Now, interestingly, we have a lot of runestones that were put into churches. We're not entirely clear why. Possibly the people who were honored in these runestones were early converts who had somehow contributed to the Christianization of the area. So the runestone is set up in the church to mark that. There may be other explanations. Certainly there are probably different explanations for different examples, but it's a possibility, at least. Now, runestones can tell us some interesting things about social relations. Multiple runestones, for instance, can be erected for the same person. So we have one case where one man had 4 sons, and each of them raised a runestone for him after his death. This may have been an attempt to emphasize the importance of the dead man, or just to paint themselves as particularly good sons. It's hard to say. Sometimes when multiple runestones commemorated the same person, it suggests that there might have been a fight over the inheritance. So we have another case where a man is commemorated by both his brothers and his sons. And that's a bit unusual, It suggests that, both of these parties are laying claim to the family in a way. Now, something that we don't often see in runestones are titles of the people being commemorated. Only about 8% of the entire runestone corpus includes titles in the inscriptions. But if you look at the runestones in Denmark and Västergötland, there's a much higher percentage that do include references to titles. So what this tells us is that in these regions, runestones were raised by the elite in many more cases. The titles that we see include those for various rulers, leaders, retainers, others. Whatever they are, they denote some type of enhanced social status. So from the retainers, we often see references to fangs and drangs. These two words are much debated. What do they mean exactly? We're not 100% sure. The general consensus is that they were in service somehow to the king, specifically the Danish king. Fangs tended to be commemorated by their sons, whereas drangs would be commemorated in most cases by parents or brothers. And scholars were a bit puzzled at first as to why that was, but when they dug into the language being used a little bit more deeply, they realized that in most cases drang is referring to a younger warrior. So of course the elder generation in that case is probably still around and working on commemorating lost sons. Now, a quite significant number of runestones were actually raised by women, and this suggests to us that women in Scandinavia, at least from the elite class, did have wealth at their disposal. From the entire corpus, we have about 12% of runestones that were raised by or sponsored by women on their own. This suggests a fairly high degree of social independence on the part of these women. Another 15% of the corpus were sponsored by women along with men. And this again suggests that they played a significant role in some of the actions and rituals that would take place after the death of members of the family. Now, what's really interesting is that women are significantly overrepresented in what are known as bridge stones, which are stones that are raised to commemorate the building of a bridge. There are many more women associated with bridge stones than you would think should be. Now, why are bridges important in Scandinavia? Well, I would ask you to think about the geography of the area. You have very mountainous regions. You have a lot of very rough terrain. You really do want to travel overland when possible, just because, the weather on the sea is not always good, especially at bad times of the year. But you do need bridges to be able to do that. So bridge building is something to be celebrated. And certainly in the later period, the more Christian period towards the end of the Viking Age, we do see some very high-ranking women, royal women, who are commemorated for bridge building that actually facilitates pilgrims traveling to various sites of interest. So there could be alternative reasons why bridges are necessary as well. Now, in terms of literary sources, this is tricky as well. Scandinavian literature is preserved mostly in oral form until they are Christianized, at which point it is written down, but through a Christian perspective. An oral tradition is a tricky thing, and you don't simply preserve it by writing it down, because oral literature is completely different than written literature. Oral literature has no single set form. It changes every time it's performed. Writing it down is actually performing another level of interpretation. It creates a text that is based on the oral tradition. It does not simply freeze the original in place. Oral literature is best looked at as a collection of scenes and dialogues and characters and tropes that are reassembled anytime somebody performs it. For those of you who've taken ML 100, you heard a lot about this when you read Beowulf. Now, new cultural and religious influences on written versions of oral literature are only going to change them further. And this is one of the reasons why scholars are still hotly debating, just how old the Poetic Edda is, for instance. Now, we can't place where in the Viking world some of these stories originated. The Eddic poems, so the oldest that we have, are preserved in two major manuscripts, both of which are Icelandic, both of which are based on a 13th century original. Beyond that, we don't really know for sure, so they have to be used with caution. But they still have to be used because they are the source for early Norse religion and basically the moral code of Scandinavians of the Viking Age. And we're going to talk more about them when we discuss Scandinavian cosmology. These are reflections of older oral literature at the very least. Now, skaldic poetry, which is the product of professional court poets, and we know a lot of their names, for instance, are also a literary source that we can use. And very often fragments of skaldic poetry have been preserved in the sagas. Now, they are very complex pieces in vocabulary, word order, and allusion, and it makes translating them immensely difficult. There are whole levels of cultural meaning that we may be missing. And again, they survive as fragments within later works, prose works. So we are not getting a complete picture of what they had to say. Now, I did mention the sagas. So the sagas are a historical form of writing that discuss the kings of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, to a lesser degree, and the settlement of Iceland. But sagas are 13th century compilations. They were not written at the time. They are written retrospectively. They are obviously dressed up to a significant degree by later elaborations. To quote a scholar who works very closely with the sagas, they must be thought of as historical novels rather than histories, so they can't be taken at face value. Where we can fill in some of the blanks is with the use of archaeology and the remains of Scandinavian material culture, and this can illuminate a great deal. But just like some of our literary sources, it illuminates them in fragments. Things that survive in pieces or that survive by chance are not necessarily going to be a complete picture. Fragments are very much open to interpretation. So I'm going to raise here the classic problem of the Scandinavian burial site that appears to hold both weapons and a female skeleton. So when this is discovered, you will have people go, "Oh, it's a shield maiden," with great glee. But you will also inevitably have people who will come up with any argument possible to undermine the idea that the occupant of that grave might in fact have used those weapons herself. Because, and I hate to say it, there are scholars who seem to consider it their mission in life to quash any theory about there being female warriors in the pre-modern world as being completely implausible. Why do you think that is? Rampant misogyny. Okay. Now, that being said, scholars who point out that women of the medieval Scandinavian period buried with weapons may not actually be shield maidens are not necessarily wrong. We don't know for sure what being buried with weapons actually means. Are these weapons the possession of the dead person, or do they simply symbolize something? It is really not so clear-cut. This issue of women being buried with weapons and what it means, this is something we see in the study of many different cultures. Actually, I lecture about it in my ancient history course with reference to Scythian women. And, in that case, I really get frustrated by it because, honestly, if you're going to make an argument that there are cultures where women necessarily take on military functions, a nomadic culture is probably one where that is pretty much a good chance. But anyways, I digress. Now, some of the positives about using archaeology include the improvements in archaeological methods over the last few decades. So, how do we in fact identify that the skeletons in these graves are female? Well, improved osteological techniques, right? Prior to these new techniques, a lot of the times, if people found graves with weapons in them, the assumption would simply be that the person in them was a man. You have new ways of surveying landscapes, so things like ground penetrating radar can give us an understanding of the landscape of Scandinavian settlements much more broadly without needing to, dig up the whole countryside. We can even do things like analyze isotopes and minerals in the teeth of recovered skeletons. And doing this can tell us, where did they grow up? Perhaps where did they spend a lot of time during their lives? Because looking at, the minerals in their teeth can tell us what type of water they drank. And if this is carefully interpreted, you can draw some conclusions about migration and other forms of movement. So there are a lot of possibilities that archaeology raises. And I think what I'm hopefully leading to here is the typical argument that the best way to study the Vikings is an interdisciplinary way, where you actually do include literary sources, archaeological sources, where you take all of these different approaches so that you can assemble these fragments into something approximating a bigger picture. Okay, so that is the end of your second and somewhat shorter lecture for the week. As I said, I will get these up and then I will focus on having next week's up on schedule. And thank you very much for listening. Have a good rest of your day.